Hello, and welcome to another one of Baby Alice's afternoon time bedtime stories. Our next story is entitled The Gorgon's Head by Nathaniel Hawthorne. The Gorgon's Head is one of our favorite fairy tales, published in Hawthorne's A Wonder Book for Girls and Boys in 1851. This 1883 edition features illustrations by Walter Crane. Enjoy the children's story within a story introduction and ending. Excerpt from the 1851 introduction. The author has long been of opinion that many of the classical myths were capable of being rendered into very capital reading for children. Children possess an unestimated sensibility to whatever is deep or high. Children possess an unestimated sensibility to whatever is deep or high, in imagination or feeling, so long as it is simple. Likewise, it is only the artificial and the complex that bewilder them. Let's begin, shall we? Are you ready, baby Alice? The Gorgon's Head by Nathaniel Hawthorne. Introduction to the Gorgon's Head. Beneath the porch of the country seat called Tanglewood, one fine autumnal morning, was assembled a merry party of little folks, with a tall youth in the midst of them. They had planned a nutting expedition and were impatiently waiting for the mists to roll up the hill slopes and for the sun to pour the warmth of the Indian summer over the fields and pastures and into the nooks of the many-coloured woods. There was a prospect of as a fine day as ever gladdened the aspect of this beautiful and comfortable world. As yet, however, the morning mist filled up the whole length and breadth of the valley, above which, on a gently sloping eminence, the mansion stood. The body of white vapour intended to within less than 100 yards of the house. It completely hid everything beyond that distance, except a few ruddy or yellow treetops, which here and there emerged, and were glorified by the early sunshine, as was likewise the broad surface of the mist. 4 or 5 miles off to the southward rose the summit of Monument Mountain, and seemed to be floating on a cloud. Some 15 miles farther away, in the same direction, appeared the loftier dome of Taconic, looking blue and indistinct, and hardly so substantial as the vapoury sea that almost rolled over it. The nearer hills which bordered the valley were half submerged and were specked with little cloud wreaths all the way to their tops. On the whole, there was so much cloud, and so little solid earth, that it had the effect of a vision. The children above mentioned, being as full of life as they could hold, kept overflowing from the porch of Tanglewood, and scampering along the gravel walk, or rush across the dewy herbage of the lawn. I can hardly tell how many of these small people there were, not less than 9 or 10, however, nor more than a dozen of all sorts, sizes, and ages, whether girls or boys. They were brothers, sisters, and cousins, together with a few of their young acquaintances who had been invited by Mr. and Mrs. Pringle to spend some of this delightful weather with their own children at Tanglewood. I am afraid to tell you their names, or even to give them any names which other children have ever been called by, because to my certain knowledge, authors sometimes get themselves into great trouble by accidentally giving the names of real persons to the characters in their books. For this reason, I mean to call them Primrose, Periwinkle, Sweet Fern, Dandelion, Blue Eye, Clover, Huckleberry, Cowslip, Squash Blossom, Milkweed, Plantain, and Buttercup. Although, to be sure, such titles might better suit a group of fairies than a company of earthly children. It is not to be supposed that these little folks were to be permitted by their careful fathers and mothers, uncles, aunts, or grandparents, to stray abroad into the woods and fields without the guardianship of some particularly grave and elderly person. Oh no, indeed. In the first sentence of my book, you will recollect that I spoke of a tall youth standing in the midst of all the children. His name, and I shall tell you his real name, because he considers it a great honor to have told the stories that are here to be printed. His name was Eustace Bright. He was a student at Williams College and had reached, I think at this period, the venerable age of 18 years, so that he felt quite like a grandfather towards Periwinkle, Dandelion, Huckleberry, Squash Blossom, Milkweed, and the rest, who were only half or a third as venerable as he. A trouble in his eyesight, such as many students think it necessary to have nowadays in order to prove their diligence at their books, had kept him from college a week or two after the beginning of the term. But for my part, I have seldom met with a pair of eyes that looked as if they could see further or better than those of Eustace Bright. This learned student was slender and rather pale, as all Yankee students are, but yet of a healthy aspect, as light and active as if he had wings to his shoes. By and by, being much addicted to wading through streamlets and across meadows, he had put on cowhide boots for the expedition. He wore a linen blouse, a cloth cap, and a pair of green spectacles, which he had assumed, probably, less for the preservation of his eyes than for the dignity that they imparted to his countenance. In either case, however, he might as well have let them alone, for Huckleberry, a mischievous little elf, crept behind Eustace as he sat on the steps of the porch, snatched the spectacles from his nose and clapped them on his own. And as the student forgot to take them back, they fell off into the grass and lay there till the next spring. Now Eustace Bright, you must know, had won great fame among the children as a narrator of wonderful stories. And though he sometimes pretended to be annoyed when they teased him for more and more, and always for more, yet I really doubt whether he liked anything quite so well as to tell them. You might have seen his eyes twinkle, therefore, when Clover, Sweet Fern, Cowslip, Buttercup, and most of their playmates besought him to relate one of his stories while they were waiting for the mist to clear up. "Yes, Cousin Eustace," said Primrose, who was a bright girl of 12, with laughing eyes and a nose that turned up a little. The morning is certainly the best time for stories with which you so often tire out our patience. We shall be in less danger of hurting your feelings by falling asleep at the most interesting points, as little Cowslip and I did last night." "Naughty Primrose!" cried Cowslip, a child of 6 years old. "I did not fall asleep, and not only shut my eyes so as to see a picture of what Cousin Eustace was telling about. His stories are good to hear at night, because we can dream about them asleep, and good in the morning too, because then we can dream about them awake. So I hope he will tell us one this very minute." "Thank you, my little Cowslip," said Eustace. "Certainly you shall have the best story I can think of, if it were only for defending me so well from that naughty Primrose. But children, I have already told you so many fairy tales that I doubt whether there is a single one which you have not heard at least twice over. I am afraid you will fall asleep in reality if I repeat any of them again." "No, no, no," cried Blue Eye, Periwinkle, Plantain, and half a dozen others. "We like a story all the better for having heard it 2 or 3 tunes before. And it is as truth as regards children that a story seems often to deepen its mark in their interest, not merely by 2 or 3, but by numberless repetitions. But Eustace Bright, in the exuberance of his resources, scorned to avail himself of an advantage which an older storyteller would have been glad to grasp at. "It would be a great pity," said he, "if a man of my learning, to say nothing of original fancy, could not find a new story every day, year in and year out, for children such as you. I will tell you one of the nursery tales that were made for the amusement of our great old grandmother, the Earth, when she was a child in frock and pinafore. There are 100 such, and it is a wonder to me that they have not long ago been put into picture books for little girls and little boys. But instead of that, old gray-bearded grandsires pore over them in musty volumes of Greek, and puzzle themselves with trying to find out when and how, and for what they were made." "Well, well, 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 Cousin Eustace," cried all the children at once. "Talk no more about your stories, but begin." "Sit down, then, every soul of you," said Eustace Bright, "and be all as still as so many mice. At the slightest interruption, whether from great, naughty Primrose, little Dandelion, or any other, I shall bite the story short off between my teeth and swallow the untold part. But in the first place, do any of you know what a Gorgon is?" "I do," said Primrose. "Then hold your tongue," rejoined Eustace, who had rather she would have known nothing about the matter. "Hold all your tongues, and I shall tell you a sweet pretty story of a Gorgon's head." And so he did, as you may begin to read on the next page, working up his sophomorical erudition with a good deal of tact, and incurring great obligations to Professor Anthon. He, nevertheless, disregarded all classical authorities whenever the vagrant audacity of his imagination impelled him to do so. The Gorgon's Head. Perseus was the son of Danae, who was the daughter of a king. And when Perseus was a very little boy, some wicked people put his mother and himself into a chest and set them afloat upon the sea. The wind blew freshly, and drove the chest away from the shore, and the uneasy billows tossed it up and down, while Danae clasped her child closely to her bosom, and dreaded that some big wave would dash its foamy crest over them both. The chest sailed on, however, and neither sank nor was upset, until when night was coming, it floated so near an island that it got entangled in a fisherman's nets, and was drawn out high and dry upon the sand. The island was called Seriphus, and it was reigned over by King Polydectes, who happened to be the fisherman's brother. The fisherman, I am glad to tell you, was an exceedingly humane and upright man. He showed great kindness to Danae and her little boy, and continued to befriend them until Perseus had grown to be a handsome youth, very strong and active and skillful in the use of arms. Long before his time, King Polydectes had seen the two strangers, the mother and her child, who had come to his dominions in a floating chest. As he was not good and kind like his brother the fisherman, but extremely wicked, he resolved to send Perseus on a dangerous enterprise, in which he would probably be killed, and then to do some great mischief to Danae herself. So this bad-hearted king spent a long while in considering what was the most dangerous thing that a young man could possibly undertake to perform. At last, having hit upon an enterprise that promised to turn out as fatally as he desired, he sent for the youthful Perseus. The young man came to the palace and found the king sitting upon his throne. "Perseus," said King Polydectes, smiling craftily upon him, "you are growing up a fine young man. You and your good mother have received a great deal of kindness from myself, as well as from my worthy brother the fisherman, and I suppose you would not be sorry to repay some of it." "Please, your majesty," answered Perseus, "I would willingly risk my life to do so." "Well then," continued the king, still with a curving smile on his lips, "I have a little adventure to propose to you, and as you are a brave and enterprising youth, you will doubtless look upon it as a great piece of good luck to have so rare an opportunity of distinguishing yourself. You must know, my good Perseus, I think of getting married to the beautiful Princess Hippodamia, and it is customary on these occasions to make the bride a present of some far-fetched and elegant curiosity. I have been a little perplexed, I must honestly confess, where to obtain anything likely to please a princess of an exquisite taste. But this morning, I flatter myself, I have thought of precisely the article. "And can I assist your majesty in obtaining it?" cried Perseus eagerly. "You can, if you are as brave as a youth as I believe you to be," replied King Polydectes with the utmost graciousness of manner. "The bridal gift which I have set my heart on presenting to the beautiful Hippodamia is the head of the Gorgon Medusa, with the snaky locks, and I depend on you, my dear Perseus, to bring it to me. So as I am anxious to settle affairs with the princess, the sooner you go in quest of the Gorgon, the better I shall be pleased." "I will set out tomorrow morning," answered Perseus. "Pray do so, my gallant youth," rejoined the king. "And Perseus, in cutting off the Gorgon's head, be careful to make a clean stroke, so as not to injure its appearance. You must bring it home in the very best condition, in order to suit the exquisite taste of the beautiful Princess Hippodamia." Perseus left the palace, but was scarcely out of hearing before Polydectes burst into laughter. Being greatly amused, wicked king that he was, to find out how readily the young man fell into the snare. The news quickly spread abroad that Perseus had undertaken to cut off the head of Medusa with the snaky locks. Everybody was rejoiced, for most of the inhabitants of the island were as wicked as the king himself, and would have liked nothing better than to see some enormous mischief happen to Danae and her son. The only good man in this unfortunate island of Seriphus appears to have been the fisherman. As Perseus walked along, therefore, the people pointed after him and made mouths, and winked to one another, and ridiculed him as loudly as they dared. "Ho, ho!" cried they. "Medusa's snakes will sting him soundly." Now, there were 3 Gorgons alive at that period, and they were the most strange and terrible monsters that had ever been since the world was made, or that have been since in after days, or that are likely to be seen in all time to come. I hardly know what sort of creature or hobgoblin to call them. They were 3 sisters, and seemed to have borne some distant resemblance to women, but were really a very frightful and mischievous species of dragon. It is indeed difficult to imagine what hideous beings these 3 sisters were. Why, instead of locks of hair, you can believe me, they had each of them 100 enormous snakes growing on their heads, all alive, twisting, wriggling, curling, and thrusting out their venomous tongues, with forked stings at the end. The teeth of the Gorgons were terribly long tusks. Their hands were made of brass, and their bodies were all over scales, which, if not iron, were something as hard and impenetrable. They had wings too, and exceedingly splendid ones, I can assure you, for every feather in them was pure, bright, glittering, burnished gold, and they looked very dazzlingly, no doubt, when the Gorgons were flying about in the sunshine. But when people happened to catch a glimpse of their glittering brightness aloft in the air, they seldom stopped to gaze, but ran and hid themselves as speedily as they could. You will think perhaps that they were afraid of being stung by the serpents that served the Gorgons instead of hair, or of having their heads bitten off by their ugly tusks, or of being torn all to pieces by their brazen claws. Well, to be sure, these were some of the dangers, but by no means the greatest, nor the most difficult to avoid. For the worst thing about these abominable Gorgons was, that if once a poor mortal fixed his eyes upon one of their faces, he was certain that very instant to be changed from warm flesh and blood into cold and lifeless stone. Thus, as you will easily perceive, it was a very dangerous adventure that the wicked king Polydectes had contrived for this innocent young man. Perseus himself, when he had thought over the matter, could not help seeing that he had very little chance of coming safely through it, and that he was far more likely to become a stone image than to bring back the head of Medusa with the snaky locks. For not to speak of other difficulties, there was one which it would have puzzled an older man than Perseus to get over. Not only must he fight with and slay this golden-winged, iron-scaled, long-tusked, brazen-clawed, snaky-haired monster, but he must do it with his eyes shut, or at least without so much as a glance at the enemy with whom he was contending. Else, while his arm was lifted to strike, he would stiffen into stone and stand with that uplifted arm for centuries until time and the wind and weather should crumble him quite away. This would be a very sad thing to befall a young man, a young male who wanted to perform a great many brave deeds and to enjoy a great deal of happiness in this bright and beautiful world. So disconsolate did these thoughts make him, that Perseus could not bear to tell his another what he had undertaken to do. He therefore took his shield, girded on his sword, and crossed over from the island to the mainland, where he sat down in a solitary place, and hardly refrained from shedding tears. But while he was in this sorrowful mood, he heard a voice close beside him. "Perseus," said the voice, "why are you sad?" He lifted his head from his hands in which he had hidden it, and behold, all alone, as Perseus had supposed himself to be, there was a stranger in the solitary place. It was a brisk, intelligent, and remarkably shrewd-looking young man, with a cloak over his shoulders, an odd sort of cap on his head, a strangely twisted staff in his hand, and a short and very crooked sword hanging by his side. He was exceedingly light and active in his figure, like a person much accustomed to gymnastic exercise, and well able to leap or run. Above all, the stranger had such a cheerful, knowing, and helpful aspect, though it was certainly a little mischievous into the bargain, that Perseus could not help feeling his spirit grow livelier as he gazed at him. Besides, being really a courageous youth, he felt greatly ashamed that anybody should have found him with tears in his eyes, like a timid little schoolboy, when after all there might be no occasion for despair. So Perseus wiped his eyes and answered the stranger pretty briskly, putting on as brave a look as he could. "I am not so very sad," said he, "only thoughtful about an adventure that I have undertaken." "Oh-ho," answered the stranger. "Well, tell me all about it, and possibly I may be of service to you. I have helped a good many young men through adventures that looked difficult enough beforehand. Perhaps you may have heard of me. I have more names than one, but the name of Quicksilver suits me as well as any other. Tell me what your trouble is, and we will talk the matter over and see what can be done." The stranger's words and manner put Perseus into quite a different mood from his former one. He resolved to tell Quicksilver all his difficulties, since he could not easily be worse off than he already was, and very possibly his new friend might give him some advice that would turn out well in the end. So he let the stranger know, in few words precisely, what the case was. How that King Polydetes wanted the head of Medusa with the snaky locks as a bridal gift for the beautiful princess Hippodamia, and how that he had undertaken to get it for him, but was afraid of being turned into stone. "And that would be a great pity," said Quicksilver with a mischievous smile. "You would make a very handsome marble statue, it is true, and it would be a considerable number of centuries before you crumbled away. But on the whole, one would rather be a young man for a few years than a stone image for a great many." "Oh, far rather," exclaimed Perseus, with the tears again standing in his eyes. "And besides, what would my dear mother do if her beloved son were turned into stone?" "Well, well, let us hope that the affair will not turn out so very badly," replied Quicksilver in an encouraging tone. "I am the very person to help you if anybody can. My sister and myself will do our utmost to bring you safe through the adventure, ugly as it now looks." "Your sister?" repeated Perseus. "Yes, my sister," said the stranger. "She is very wise, I promise you. And as for myself, I generally have all my wits about me, such as they are. If you show yourself bold and cautious, and follow our advice, you need not fear being a stone image yet awhile. But first of all, you must polish your shield, till you can see your face in it as distinctly as in a mirror." This seemed to Perseus rather an odd beginning of the adventure, for he thought it of far more consequence that the shield be strong enough to defend him from the Gorgon's brazen claws, than that it should be bright enough to show him the reflection of his face. However, concluding that Quicksilver knew better than himself, he immediately set to work, and scrubbed the shield with so much diligence and goodwill that it very quickly shone like the moon at harvest time. Quicksilver looked at it with a smile and nodded his approbation. Then, taking off his own short and crooked sword, he girded it about Perseus, instead of the one which he had before worn. "No sword but mine will answer your propose. No sword but mine will answer your purpose," observed he. "The blade has a most excellent temper, and will cut through iron and brass as easily as through the slenderest twig. And now we will set out. The next thing is to find the 3 grey women, who will tell us where to find the nymphs." "The 3 grey women?" cried Perseus, to whom this seemed only a new difficulty in the path of his adventure. "Pray who may the 3 grey women be? I never heard of them before." "They are 3 very strange old ladies," said Quicksilver, laughing. "They have but 1 eye among them, and only 1 tooth. Moreover, you must find them out by starlight, or in the dusk of the evening, for they never show themselves by the light either of the sun or moon." "But," said Perseus, "why should I waste my time with these 3 grey women? Would it not be better to set out at once in search of the terrible Gorgons?" "No, no," answered his friend. "There are other things to be done before you can find your way to the Gorgons. This is nothing for it but to hunt up these old ladies. There is nothing for it but to hunt up these old ladies, and when we meet with them, you may be sure that the Gorgons are not a great way off. Come, let us be stirring." Perseus, by this time, felt so much confidence in his companion's sagacity, that he made no more objections, and professed himself ready to begin the adventure immediately. They accordingly set out, and walked at a pretty brisk pace, so brisk indeed that Perseus found it rather difficult to keep up with his nimble friend Quicksilver. To say the truth, he had a singular idea that Quicksilver was furnished with a pair of winged shoes, which of course helped him along marvellously. And then too, when Perseus looked sideways at him, out of the corner of his eye, he seemed to see wings on the side of his head, although if he turned a full gaze, there were no such things to be perceived, but only an odd kind of cap. But at all events, the twisted staff was evidently a great convenience to Quicksilver, and enabled him to proceed so fast that Perseus, though a remarkably active young man, began to be out of breath. "Here," cried Quicksilver at last, for he knew well enough, rogue that he was, how hard Perseus found it to keep pace with him. "Take you the staff, for you need it a great deal more than I. Are there no better walkers than yourself in the island of Seriphus?" "I could walk pretty well," said Perseus, glancing slyly at his companion's feet, "if I had only a pair of winged shoes." "You must see about getting you a pair," answered Quicksilver. But the staff helped Perseus along so bravely that he no longer felt the slightest weariness. In fact, the stick seemed to be alive in his hand and to lend some of its life to Perseus. He and Quicksilver now walked onward at their ease, talking very sociably together, and Quicksilver told so many pleasant stories about his former adventures and how well his wits had served him on various occasions, that Perseus began to think him a very wonderful person. He evidently knew the world, and nobody is so charming to a young man as a friend who has that kind of knowledge. Perseus listened the more eagerly, in the hope of brightening his own wits by what he had heard. At last he happened to recollect that Quicksilver had spoken of a sister who was to lend her assistance in the future, which they were now bound upon. "Where is she?" he inquired. "Shall we not meet her soon?" "All at the proper time," said his companion. "But this sister of mine, you must understand, is quite a different sort of character from myself. She is very grave and prudent, seldom smiles, never laughs, and makes it a rule not to utter a word unless she has something particularly profound to say. Neither will she listen to any but the wisest conversation." "Dear me," ejaculated Perseus, "I shall be afraid to say a syllable." She is a very accomplished person, I assure you," continued Quicksilver, "and has all the arts and sciences at her fingers' ends. In short, she is so immoderately wise that many people call her wisdom personified. But to tell you the truth, she has hardly vivacity enough for my taste, and I think you would scarcely find her so pleasant a travelling companion as myself. She has her good points, nevertheless, and you will find the benefit of them in your encounter with the Gorgons." By this time it had grown quite dusk. They were now come to a very wild and desert place, overgrown with shaggy bushes, and so silent and solitary that nobody seemed ever to have dwelt or journeyed there. All was waste and desolate, in the grey twilight which grew every moment more obscure. Perseus looked about him rather disconsolately, and asked Quicksilver whether they had a great deal further to go. "Hist, hist," whispered his companion. "Make no noise. This is just the time and place to meet the 3 grey women. Be careful that they do not see you before you see them, for though they have but a single eye among the 3, it is as sharp-sighted as half a dozen common eyes." "But what must I do," asked Perseus, "when we meet them?" Quicksilver explained to Perseus how the 3 grey women managed with their one eye. They were in the habit, it seems, of changing it from one to another, as if it had been a pair of spectacles, or, which would have suited them better, quizzing glass. When one of the 3 had kept the eye a certain time, she took it out of the socket and passed it to one of her sisters, whose turn it might happen to be, and who immediately clapped it into her own head and enjoyed a peep at the visible world. Thus it will easily be understood that only one of the 3 grey women could see, while the other 2 were in utter darkness. And moreover, at the instant when the eye was passing from hand to hand, neither of the poor ladies was able to see a wink. "I have heard of a great many strange things in my day, and have witnessed not a few, but none, it seems to me, that can compare with the oddity of these three grey women, all peeping through a single eye. So thought Perseus likewise, and was so astonished that he almost fancied his companion was joking with him, and that there were no such old women in the world. "You will soon find whether I tell the truth or no," observed Quicksilver. "Hark! Hush! Hist! Hist! There they come now." Perseus looked earnestly through the dusk of the evening, and there, sure enough, at no great distance off, he descried the three grey women. The light being so faint, he could not well make out what sort of figures they were, only he discovered that they had long grey hair, and as they came nearer, he saw that two of them had but the empty socket of an eye in the middle of their foreheads. But in the middle of the third sister's forehead there was a very large, bright, and piercing eye, which sparkled like a great diamond in a ring, and so penetrating did it seem to be that Perseus could not help thinking it must possess the gift of seeing in the darkness midnight just as perfectly as at noonday. The sight of three persons' eyes was melted and collected into that single one. Thus the three old dames got along about as comfortably upon the whole as if they could all see at once. She, who chanced to have the eye in her forehead, led the other two by the hands, peeping sharply about her all the while, insomuch that Perseus dreaded lest she could see right through the thick clump of bushes behind which he and Quicksilver had hidden themselves. My stars! It was positively terrible to be within reach of so very sharp an eye. But before they reached the clump of bushes, one of the three grey women spoke.
"Sister, Sister Scarecrow," cried she, "you have had the eye long enough. It is my turn now."
"Let me keep it a moment longer, Sister Nightmare," answered Scarecrow. "I thought I had a glimpse of something behind that thick bush."
"Well, and what of that?" retorted Nightmare peevishly. "Can't I see into a thick bush as easily as yourself? The eye is mine as well as yours, and I know the use of it as well as you, or maybe a little better. I insist upon taking a peep immediately."
But here the third sister, whose name was Shakejoint, began to complain, and said that it was her turn to have the eye, and that Scarecrow and Nightmare wanted to keep it all to themselves. And to end the dispute, old Dame Scarecrow took the eye out of her forehead and held it forth in her hand.
"Take it, one of you," cried she, "and quit this foolish quarrelling. For my part, I shall be glad of a little thick darkness. Take it quickly, however, or I must clap it into my own head again."
Accordingly, both Nightmare and Shakejoint stretched out their hands, groping eagerly to snatch the eye out of the hand of Scarecrow. But being both alike blind, they could not easily find where Scarecrow's hand was, and Scarecrow, being now just as much in the dark as Shakejoint and Nightmare, could not at once meet either of their hands in order to put the eye into it. Thus, as you will see, with half an eye, my wise little auditors, these good old dames had fallen into a strange perplexity. For though the eye shone and glistened like a star as Scarecrow held it out, yet the grey women caught not the least glimpse of its light, and were all three in utter darkness from too impatient a desire to see. Quicksilver was so much tickled at beholding Shakejoint and Nightmare both groping for the eye, and each finding fault with Scarecrow and one another, that he could scarcely help laughing aloud. "Now is your time," he whispered to Perseus. "Quick, quick, before they clap the eye into either of their heads, rush out upon the ladies and snatch it from Scarecrow's hand. At an instant, while the three grey women were still scolding each other, Perseus leapt front behind the clump of bushes and made himself master of the prize. The marvellous eye, as he held it in his hand, shone very brightly and seemed to look up into his face with a knowing air, and an expression as if it would have winked, had it been provided a pair of eyelids for that purpose. But the grey women knew nothing of what had happened, and each supposing that one of the sisters was in possession of the eye, they began to quarrel anew. At last, as Perseus did not wish to put these respectable dames to greater inconvenience than was really necessary, he thought it right to explain the matter. "My good ladies," said he, "pray do not be angry with one another. If anybody is in fault, it is myself, for I have the honour to hold your very brilliant and excellent eye in my own hand." You have our eye? And who are you?" screamed the three grey women, all in a breath, for they were terribly frightened, of course, at hearing a strange voice, and discovering that their eyesight had got into the hands of they could not guess whom. "Oh, what shall we do, sisters? What shall we do? We are all in the dark. Give us our eye. Give us our one precious solitary eye. You have two of your own. Give us our eye." "Tell them," whispered Quicksilver to Perseus, "that they shall have back the eye as soon as they direct you where to find the nymphs, who have the flying slippers, the magic wallet, and the helmet of darkness." "My dear, good, admirable old ladies," said Perseus, addressing the grey women, "there is no occasion for putting yourselves into such a fright. I am by no means a bad young man. You shall have back your eye, safe and sound, and as bright as ever, the moment you tell me where to find the nymphs." "The nymphs? Goodness me! Sisters, what nymphs does he mean?" screamed Scarecrow. "There are a great many nymphs, people say. Some that go a-hunting in the woods, and some that live inside of trees, and some that have a comfortable home in fountains of water. We know nothing at all about them. We are three unfortunate old souls that go wandering about in the dusk, and never had but one eye among us, and that one you have stolen away. Oh, give it back, good stranger, whoever you are, give it back." All this while the three grey women were groping with their outstretched hands and trying their utmost to get hold of Perseus, but he took good care to keep out of their reach. "My respectable dames," said he, for his mother had taught him always to use the greatest civility, "I hold your eye fast in my hand, and shall keep it safely for you, until you please to tell me where to find these nymphs. The nymphs, I mean, who keep the enchanted wallet, the flying slippers, and the helmet of invisibility."
"Mercy on us, sisters! What is the young man talking about?"
exclaimed Scarecrow, Nightmare, and Shakejoint to one another with great appearance of astonishment.
"A pair of flying slippers, quoth he? His heels would quickly fly higher than his head. If he was silly enough to put them on, and a helmet of invisibility, how could a helmet make him invisible unless it were big enough for him to hide under? And an enchanted wallet? What sort of a contrivance may that be, I wonder? No, good stranger, we can tell you nothing of these marvellous things. You have two eyes of your own, and we have but a single one amongst us three. You can find out such wonders better than three blind old creatures like us."
Perseus, hearing them talk in this way, began really to think that the grey women knew nothing of the matter, and as it grieved him to have put them to so much trouble, he was just on the point of restoring their eye and asking pardon for his rudeness and snatching it away, but Quicksilver caught his hand. "Don't let them make a fool of you," said he. "These grey women are the only persons in the world that can tell you where to find the nymphs, and unless you get that information, you will never succeed in cutting off the head of Medusa with those snaky locks. Keep fast hold of the eye, and all will go well." As it turned out, Quicksilver was in the right. There are but few things that people prize so much as they do their eyesight, and the grey women valued their single eye as highly as if it had been half a dozen, which was the number they ought to have had. Finding that there was no other way of recovering it, they at last told Perseus what he wanted to know. No sooner had they done so than he immediately, and with the utmost respect, clapped the eye into the vacant socket in one of their foreheads, thanked them for their kindness, and bade them farewell. Before the young man was out of hearing, however, they had got into a new dispute, because he happened to have given the eye to Scarecrow, who had already taken her turn of it when their trouble with Perseus commenced. It is greatly to be feared that the three grey women were very much in the habit of disturbing their mutual harmony by bickerings of this sort, which was the more pity as they could not conveniently do without one another, and were evidently intended to be inseparable companions. As a general rule, I would advise all people, whether sisters or brothers, old or young, who have chanced to have but one eye amongst them, to cultivate forbearance, and not all insist upon peeping through it all at once. Quicksilver and Perseus, in the meantime, were making the best of their way in quest of the nymphs. The old dames had given them such particular directions that they were not long in finding them out. They proved to be very different persons from Nightmare, Shakejoint, and Scarecrow, for instead of being old, they were young and beautiful. And instead of one eye amongst the sisterhood, each nymph had two exceedingly bright eyes of their own, with which she looked very kindly at Perseus. They seemed to be acquainted with Quicksilver, and when he told them the adventure which Perseus had undertaken, they made no difficulty about giving him the valuable articles that were in their custody in the first place. They brought out what appeared to be a small purse made of deerskin, and curiously embroidered, and bade him be sure and keep it safe. This was the magic wallet. The nymphs next produced a pair of shoes, or slippers, or sandals, with a nice little pair of wings at the heel of each. "Put them on, Perseus," said Quicksilver. "You will find yourself as light-heeled as you can desire for the remainder of our journey." So Perseus proceeded to put one of the slippers on, while he laid the other on the ground by his side. Unexpectedly, however, the other slipper spread its wings, fluttered up off the ground, and would probably have flown away if Quicksilver had not made a leap, and luckily caught it in the air. "Be more careful," said he, as he gave it back to Perseus. "It would frighten the birds up aloft if they should see a flying slipper amongst them." When Perseus had got on both of these wonderful slippers, he was altogether too buoyant to tread on earth. Making a step or two, lo and behold, upward he popped into the air, high above the heads of Quicksilver and the nymphs, and found it very difficult to clamber down again. Winged slippers and all such high-flying contrivances are seldom quite easy to manage until one grows a little accustomed to them. Quicksilver laughed at his companion's involuntary activity, and told him that he must not be in so desperate a hurry, but must wait for the invisible helmet. The good-natured nymphs had the helmet, with its dark tuft of waving plumes, all in readiness to put upon his head. And now there happened about as wonderful an incident as anything that I have yet told you. The instant before the helmet was put on, there stood Perseus, a beautiful young man, with golden ringlets and rosy cheeks, the crooked sword by his side, and the brightly polished shield upon his arm. A figure that seemed all made up of courage, sprightliness, and glorious light. But when the helmet had descended over his white brow, there was no longer any Perseus to be seen, nothing but empty air. Even the helmet that covered him with its invisibility had vanished. "Where are you, Perseus?" asked Quicksilver. "Why, here, to be sure," answered Perseus, very quietly, although his voice seemed to come out of the transparent atmosphere. "Just where I was a moment ago. Don't you see me?"
"No, indeed," answered his friend. "You are hidden under the helmet, but if I cannot see you, neither can the Gorgons. Follow me, therefore, and we will try your dexterity in using the winged slippers."
With these words, Quicksilver's cap spread its wings as if his head were about to fly away from his shoulders, but his whole figure rose lightly into the air, and Perseus followed. By the time they had ascended a few hundred feet, the young man began to feel what a delightful thing it was to leave the dull earth so far beneath him, and to be able to flit about like a bird. It was now deep night. Perseus looked upward and saw the round, bright, silvery moon, and thought that he should desire nothing better than to soar up thither and spend his life there. Then he looked downward again and saw the earth, with its seas and lakes, and the silver courses of its rivers, and its snowy mountain peaks, and the breadth of its fields, and the dark cluster of its woods, and its cities of white marble. And with the moonshine sleeping over the whole scene, it was as beautiful as the moon or any other star could be. And among other objects he saw the island of Seripulus, where his dear mother was. Sometimes he and Quicksilver approached a cloud that at a distance looked as if it were made of fleecy silver, although when they plunged into it they found themselves chilled and moistened with grey mist. So swift was their flight, however, that in an instant they emerged from the cloud into the moonlight again. Once a high soaring eagle flew right against the invisible Perseus. The bravest sights were the meteors that gleamed suddenly out, as if a bonfire had been kindled in the sky, and made the moonshine pale for as much as 100 miles around them. As the two companions flew onward, Perseus fancied that he could hear the rustle of a garment close by his side. And it was on the side opposite to the one where he beheld Quicksilver, yet only Quicksilver was visible. "Whose garment is this?" inquired Perseus, "that keeps rustling close behind me in the breeze?"
"Oh, it's my sister's," answered Quicksilver. "She is coming along with us, as I told you she would. We could do nothing without the help of my sister. You have no idea how wise she is. She has such eyes too. Why, she can see you at this moment just as distinctly as if you were not invisible, and I'll venture to say she will be the first to discover the Gorgons."
By this time in their swift voyage through the air, they had come within sight of the great ocean, and were soon flying over it. Far beneath them the waves tossed themselves tumultuously in mid-sea, or rolled a white surf line upon the long beaches, or foamed against the rocky cliffs with a roar that was thunderous. In the lower world, although it became a gentle murmur, like the voice of a baby half asleep, before it reached the ears of Perseus, just then a voice spoke in the air close by him. It seemed to be a woman's voice, and was melodious, though not exactly what might be called sweet, but grave and mild. "Perseus," said the voice, "there are the Gorgons." "Where?" exclaimed Perseus. "I cannot see them." "On the shore of that island beneath you," replied the voice. "A pebble dropped from your hand will strike in the midst of them." "I told you she would be the first. I told you she would be the first to discover them," said Quicksilver to Perseus, "and there they are." Straight downward 2 or 3,000 feet below them, Perseus perceived a small island, with the sea breaking into white foam all around its rocky shore, except on one side, where there was a beach of snowy sand. He descended towards it, and looking earnestly at a cluster or heap of brightness at the foot of a precipice of black rocks, behold, there were the terrible Gorgons. They lay fast asleep, soothed by the thunder of the sea, for it required a tumult that would have deafened everybody else to lull such fierce creatures into slumber. The moonlight glistened on their steely scales, and on their golden wings which drooped idly over the sand. Their brazen claws, horrible to look at, were thrust out, and clutched the wave-beating fragments of rock, while the sleeping Gorgons dreamed of tearing some poor mortal all to pieces. The snakes that served them instead of hair seemed likewise to be asleep, although now and then one would writhe, and lift its head, and thrust out its forked tongue, emitting a drowsy hiss, and then let itself subside among its sister snakes. The Gorgons were more like an awful, gigantic kind of insect. Immense, golden-winged beetles, or dragonflies, or things of that sort, at once ugly and beautiful, than like anything else, only that they were 1,000 and 1,000,000 times as big. And with all this, there was something partly human about them too. Luckily for Perseus, their faces were completely hidden from him by the posture in which they lay, for had he but looked one instant at them, he would have fallen heavily out of the air, an image of senseless stone. "Now," whispered Quicksilver, as he hovered by the side of Perseus, "now is your time to do the deed. Be quick, for if one of the Gorgons should awake, you are too late." "Which shall I strike at?" asked Perseus, drawing his sword and descending a little lower. They all three look alike. All three have snaky locks. Which of the three is Medusa?" It must be understood that Medusa was the only one of these dragon monsters whose heads Perseus could possibly cut off. As for the other two, let him have the sharpest sword that ever was forged, and he might have hacked away by the hour together without doing there the least harm. "Be cautious," said the calm voice which had spoken to him. "Be cautious," said the calm voice which had before spoken to him. "One of the Gorgons is stirring in his sleep, and is just about to turn over. That is Medusa. Do not look at her. The sight would turn you to stone. Look at the reflection of her face and figure in the bright mirror of your shield." Perseus now understood Quicksilver's motive for so earnestly exhorting him to polish his shield. In its surface he could safely look at the reflection of the Gorgon's face, and there it was, that terrible countenance, mirrored in the brightness of the shield, with the moonlight falling over it and displaying all its horrors. The snakes, whose venomous natures could not altogether sleep, kept twisting themselves over the forehead. It was the fiercest and most horrible face that ever was seen or imagined, and yet with a strange, fearful, and savage kind of beauty in it. The eyes were closed, and the Gorgon was still in a deep slumber, but there was an unquiet expression disturbing her features, as if the monster was troubled with an ugly dream. She gnashed her white tusks, and dug into the sand with her brazen claws. The snakes, too, seemed to feel Medusa's dream, and to be made more restless by it. They twined themselves into tumultuous knots, writhed fiercely, and uplifted 100 hissing heads without opening their eyes. Now, whispered Quicksilver, who was growing impatient, "make a dash at that monster." "But be calm. said the grave, melodious voice at the young man's side. "Look in your shield as you fly downward, and take care that you do not miss your first stroke." Perseus flew cautiously downward, still keeping his eye on Medusa's face, as reflected in his shield. The nearer he came, the more terrible did the snaky visage and metallic body of the monster grow. At last, when he found himself hovering over her within arm's length, Perseus lifted his sword, where at the same instant each separate snake upon the Gorgon's head stretched threateningly upward, and Medusa unclosed her eyes. But she awoke too late. The sword was sharp, the stroke fell like a lightning flash, and the head of the wicked Medusa tumbled from her body.
"Admirably done,"
cried Quicksilver. "Make haste and clap the head into your magic wallet." To the astonishment of Perseus, the small embroidered wallet, which had hung about his neck, and which had hitherto been no bigger than a purse, grew all at once large enough to contain Medusa's head. As quick as thought, he snatched it up with the snake still writhing upon it, and thrust it in. "Your task is done," said the calm voice. "Now fly, for the other Gorgons will do their utmost to take vengeance for Medusa's death." It was indeed necessary to take flight, for Perseus had not done the deed so quietly, but that the clash of his sword, and the hissing of the snakes, and the thump of Medusa's head as it tumbled upon the sea-beaten sand, awoke the other two monsters. There they sat for an instant, sleepily rubbing their eyes with their brazen fingers, while all the snakes on their heads reared themselves on end with surprise, and with venomous malice against they knew not what. But when the Gorgon saw the scaly carcass of Medusa, headless, and her golden wings all ruffled and half spread out on the sand, it was really awful to hear what yells and screeches they set up. And then the snakes, they set forth 100-fold hiss, with one consent, and Medusa's snakes answered them out of the magic wallet. No sooner were the Gorgons broad awake than they hurtled upward into the air, brandishing their brass talons, gnashing their horrible tusks, and flapping their huge wings so widely that some of the golden feathers were shaken out, and floated down upon the shore. And there perhaps those very feathers he scattered, till this day. Up rose the Gorgons, as I tell you, staring horribly about, in hopes of turning somebody to stone, had Perseus looked them in the face, or had he fallen into their clutches. His poor mother would never have kissed her boy again. But he took good care to turn his eyes another way, and as he wore the helmet of invisibility, the Gorgons knew not in what direction to follow him, nor did he fail to make the best use of the wing slippers. By soaring upward a perpendicular mile or so, at that height, when the screams of those abominable creatures sounded faintly beneath him, he made a straight course for the island of Seriphus, in order to carry Medusa's head to King Polydectes. I have no time to tell you of several marvellous things that befell Perseus on his way homeward, such as his killing a hideous sea monster as it was on the point of devouring a beautiful maiden, nor how he changed an enormous giant into a mountain of stone, merely by showing him the head of the Gorgon. If you doubt this story later, you may make a voyage to Africa some day or other, and see the very mountain which is still known by the ancient giant's name. Finally, our brave Perseus arrived at the island, where he expected to see his dear mother, but during his absence, the wicked king had treated Danae so very ill. So very ill that she was compelled to make her escape, and had taken refuge in a temple where some good priests were extremely kind to her. These praiseworthy priests and the kind-hearted fishermen who had first shown hospitality to Danae and little Perseus when he found them afloat in the chest seemed to have been the only persons on the island who cared about doing right. All the rest of the people, as well as King Polydectes himself, were remarkably ill-behaved and deserved no better destiny than that which was now to happen. Not finding his mother at home, Perseus went straight to the palace and was immediately ushered into the presence of the king. Polydectes was by no means rejoiced to see him, for he had felt almost certain in his own evil mind that the Gorgons would have torn the poor young man to pieces and have eaten him up out of the way. However, seeing him safely returned, he put the best space he could upon the matter and asked Perseus how he had succeeded.
"Have you performed your promise?" inquired he. "Have you brought me the head of Medusa with the snaky locks? If not, young man, it will cost you dear, for I must have a bridal present for the beautiful Princess Hippodamia, and there is nothing else that she would admire so much."
"Yes, please, your majesty," answered Perseus, in a quiet way, as if it were no very wonderful deed for such a young man as he to perform. "I have brought you the Gorgon's head, snaky locks and all."
"Indeed, pray let me see it," quoth King Polydectes. It must be a very curious spectacle if all that travels tell about it be true." "It must be a very curious spectacle if all that travelers tell about it be true."
"Your majesty is in the right," replied Perseus. "It really is an object that will be pretty certain to fix the regards of all who look at it. And if your majesty think fit, I would suggest that a holiday be proclaimed, and that all your majesty's subjects be summoned to behold this wonderful curiosity. Few of them, I imagine, have seen a Gorgon's head before, and perhaps never may again." The king well knew that his subjects were an idle set of reprobates, and when very fond of sightseeing, as idle persons usually are, so he took the young man's advice and sent out heralds and messengers in all directions to blow the trumpet at the street corners and in the marketplaces and wherever two roads met, and summon everybody to court. Thither, accordingly, came a great multitude of good-for-nothing vagabonds, all of whom, out of pure love of mischief, would have been glad if Perseus had met with some ill hap in his encounter with the Gorgons. If there were any better people in the land, as I really hope there may have been, although the story tells nothing about any such, they stayed quietly at home, minding their own business and taking care of their little children. Most of the inhabitants, at all events, ran as fast as they could to the palace, and shoved and pushed and elbowed one another in their eagerness to get near a balcony on which Perseus showed himself, holding the embroidered wallet in his hand. On a platform within full view of the balcony sat the mighty King Polydectes, amid his evil counselors and with his flattering courtiers in a semicircle round about him. Monarchs, counselors, courtiers, and subjects all gazed eagerly towards Perseus. "Show us the head! Show us the head!" shouted the people, and there was a fierceness in their cry, as if they would tear Perseus to pieces, unless he should satisfy them with what he had to show. "Show us the head of Medusa with the snaky locks!" A feeling of sorrow and pity came over the young Perseus. "O King Polydectes," he cried, "and ye many people, I am very loath to show you the Gorgon's head."
"Ah, the villain and coward!"
yelled the people more fiercely than before.
"He is making a game of us. He has no Gorgon's head. Show us the head if you have it, or we will take your own head for a football."
The evil counsellors whispered bad advice in the king's ear, and the courtiers murmured with one consent that Perseus had shown disrespect to their royal lord and master, and the great king Polydectes himself waved his hand and ordered him with the stern, deep voice of authority on his peril to produce the head. "Show me the Gorgon's head, or I will cut off your own." And Perseus sighed. "This instant," repeated Polydectes, "or you die." "Behold it then," cried Perseus, in a voice like the blast of a trumpet. And suddenly, holding up the head, not an eyelid had time to wink before the wicked king Polydectes, his evil counsellors, and all his fierce subjects were no longer anything but the mere images of a monarch and his people. They were all fixed, however, in the look and attitude of that moment. At the first glimpse of the terrible head of Medusa, they whitened into marble, and Perseus thrust the head back into his wallet, and went to tell his dear mother that she need no longer be afraid of the wicked King Polydectes. After the story. "Is not that a very fine story?" asked Eustace. Oh yes, cried Cowslip, clapping her hands. "And those funny old women, with only one eye amongst them. I never heard of anything so strange." "As to their one tooth, which they shifted about," observed Primrose, "there was nothing so very wonderful in that. I suppose it was a false tooth. But think of your turning Mercury into quicksilver and talking about his sister. You are too ridiculous." "And was she not his sister?" asked Eustace Bright. "If I had thought of it sooner, I would have described her as a maiden lady who kept a pet owl." "Well, at any rate," said Primrose, "your story seems to have driven away the mist." And indeed, while the tale was going forward, the vapours had been quite exhaled from the landscape. A scene was now disclosed which the spectators might almost fancy as having been created since they had last looked in the direction where it lay. About half a mile distant, in the lap of the valley, now appeared a beautiful lake, which reflected a perfect image of its own wooded banks, and of the summits of the more distant hills. It gleamed in glassy tranquillity, without the trace of a winged breeze on any part of its bosom. Beyond its further shore was Monument Mountain, in a recumbent position, stretching almost across the valley. Eustace Bright compared it to a huge headless sphinx, wrapped in a Persian shawl, and indeed so rich and diversified was the autumnal foliage of its woods, that the smile of the shawl was by no means too high-coloured for the reality. In the lower ground between Tanglewood and the lake, the clumps of trees and borders of woodland were chiefly golden-leaved or dusky brown, as having suffered more from frost than the foliage on the hillsides. Over all this scene there was a genial sunshine. Over all this scene there was a genial sunshine, intermingled with a slight haze, which made it unspeakably soft and tender. Oh, what a day of Indian summer was it going to be! The children snatched their baskets and set forth with hop, skip and jump, and all sorts of frisks and gambols, while Cousin Eustace proved his fitness to preside over the party by outdoing all their antics and performing several new capers which none of them could ever hope to imitate. Behind went a good old dog whose name was Ben. He was one of the most respectable and kind-hearted of quadrupeds, and probably felt it to be his duty not to trust the children away from their parents without some better guardian than this feather-brained Eustace Bright. The end. I hope you enjoyed that story, baby Alice. that ends the story of The Gorgon's Head by Nathaniel Hawthorne. Good night, baby Elias.